The Upper Essequibo Conservation Concession, many of you might not know exactly where that is, but you'll see in a minute, is 312 square miles in area. Our sister CARICOM nation of Barbados is 166. St. Lucia is 238. Dominica is 291. Now, we shouldn't exactly compare a concession with a country, two slightly different things. But you would appreciate that managing one or the other could use the help of modern technology. Our next presenter is going to show us a small example of this. A few years ago, well, maybe more than a few years ago, Curtis Bernard and I trained together with two other fine gentlemen, one of whom is in the room, in the Netherlands and in Germany, in GIS. And so it was with great personal pleasure that I'd like to introduce Curtis Bernard, Technical Director at Conservation International Guyana, to give the first presentation today on GIS Day. Curtis?
All right. Thanks a lot, Vijay. And with all of the protocols observed already, I'd like to, first of all, disappoint Vijay a little bit. I'm not going to talk about the Upper Essequibo Conservation Concession this morning. What I'll talk about is some work in which myself and colleagues from the Protected Area Commission and a colleague from the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent did to answer one of the questions that we see as being necessary to be answered for the development of Guyana. And I really appreciate the way the DVC spoke about technology as a tool, because I myself prefer to refer to GIS really as a tool. It has its own science and its own technologies associated with it, but it really is a tool to help to answer questions, and answer questions of a particular type. And I'll explain to you a little bit more in the presentation. But just to give you a little bit of the background of the challenge that we saw that we were trying to utilize this tool of GIS in answering is to answer the question regarding how we can manage our biodiversity. And just for those of us who would not be familiar with the fancy word biodiversity, it's really a conjoined word between two regular words, biological and diversity. And all it really means is the variety of living things that exist in a particular area. Right? And Guyana is one of the countries, even though we might be labeled as least developed and all of the labels you would have heard just now, we're one of the countries that have the distinction of still maintaining quite a lot of our biological diversity. And we've also committed to ourselves and also committed to the globe that we're going to maintain that biodiversity. Right? And the creation and management of protected areas is one of the ways in which we are setting out to maintain the biodiversity that we have within our country. One of the steps we've made is that in 2011, we actually established Protected Areas Law. And we established a Protected Areas Commission that had a very unique challenge in a country like Guyana, where you have so much biodiversity. Everywhere in the country really could be considered important for biodiversity. So the Protected Area had a challenge in really thinking about these questions. One, what are the most important aspects of our biodiversity, and where are they located? This is a question that GIS could help with, and I'll explain a little bit how we used it, how we use the tool to help to answer that question. The second question really is, what's the cost of maintaining biodiversity, and how is it distributed across the country? Again, because it's about a distribution or where, GIS could help us to answer that question. And then the third question, which is really the main question that we were trying to answer, is what are the most important places for the maintenance of biodiversity? So where are the places that we must pay great attention to in this country of important biodiversity? That is the most important, the most critical areas for us to focus on. Right, and these are the questions that we use the tool of GIS to answer. Right, so in terms of the important aspects of biodiversity, we focused on two things. We focused on mapping where the different ecosystems exist. And if we can have a quiz afterwards, co-chairs, maybe someone could explain for me what ecosystems are. But this is one of the things that we use GIS to do, to map areas in which you have fairly similar composition of living things and fairly similar composition in terms of the conditions, soil, temperature, and so on, elevation, across the country. The second thing that we used GIS for was to map where species, the individual groups of organisms, or the individual types of organisms existed. And the map that you see here is a map of richness of species, meaning the red colors are the areas where you have a high number of different types of species existing. So this was our answer to the first question. Where are what are the most important elements of biodiversity in Guyana and where they're located? Our answer to the second question was really about measuring what we call the cost of maintaining that biodiversity. And what we did was to map again, this is a fancy term, I'll explain it a little bit, the opportunity cost. It means the cost, the value that could be derived from other activities carried out at that site. And we focused on the four things that we use most of our land in Guyana for: forestry, mining, agriculture, and residential. And based on the value that could be derived from these activities across the country, we mapped out what we considered to be the cost and looked at how that cost is distributed across the country. Now, this was just the answer to the second question. The third question was a little bit more complex. So we had to use a specialized tool that could use all of that information that I just presented to you on where species are, where ecosystems are, and how costs are distributed across the country, to then help us to say, okay, if we want to maintain all of these things and we want to do it at the least cost, where can we find those areas? And that's what this tool that is called MarkSan, as developed by the University of Queensland in Australia, helped us to do. So basically what this tool did was to look at the various ecosystems, look at the various species. We said that we wanted to have represented in these most important areas a certain amount of each one of the species and ecosystems, and we wanted it to be represented in the areas of least cost. So at the end of it, this was the answer to our third question. Where must we maintain, what are the most important areas in all of this 83,000 square miles, 21 million hectares, however you want to look at it, in the country, where are the most important areas for the maintenance of biodiversity? And this was our output, looking at the distribution of priority areas for biodiversity conservation. So this is what I'd like to share with you this morning, and I'll hand back to Vijay.